Okay, welcome back. And in this video, we are going to cover and finish up the remainder of chapter 10. We have a couple more theories of personality to cover in this chapter on personality, and then we'll look at personality testing. So the last video, we dove into Freudian personality theory or psychoanalysis. We looked at trait theory, and now we're kind of wrapping up with a few more other different perspectives to think about with personality. And so we're going back, we're dipping our toes back into learning theory a little bit. Particularly, we're looking at behaviorism and social cognitive theory and sort of what they have to say about personality theory. Hopefully, these two theoretical perspectives are not new to you. You've encountered them in previous chapters of the Rathus text. So, what do they have to say? Well, people like John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, for example, really didn't, as far as personality was concerned, really weren't too interested in things that were sort of unmeasurable or things that are kind of going on between the ears that we can't necessarily see and measure directly. So really, like behaviorism, we've learned up until this point, there is a huge emphasis on what is directly measurable and not so much about undetectable or unmeasurable mental structures. So John B. Watson, for example, didn't put a whole lot of emphasis on on personality, and B.F. Skinner, conversely, talks about personality a little bit, but again, sort of ignores a lot of the cognition that's involved, but talks more about how reinforcement, this idea of reinforcement, is what sort of shapes our behavior and ultimately shapes our personality. So these two psychologists, while both being sort of rock stars in their field and within their perspectives, sort of ignored a lot of the things that are going on between our ears, including like personal choice and freedom, and also self-direction. Basically, saying we don't have free will. They were sort of proponents of thinking we did not have free will. We're sort of shaped by all of these other things in our environment. Social cognitive theory, on the other hand, is sort of an extension of learning theory. It's a much more nuanced theory of learning, in my opinion. Of course, environmental factors are important, but there are other factors that are important as well. So Bandura talks about how all of these different variables, these person variables, are sort of what shapes our shape our behavior and our personality, and the just our context or our environment alone isn't enough to explain kind of what's going on here. We have all kinds of different variables, our values, our expectations, how we learn and encode information, the things that we're good at, that we feel competent in, how good we are at regulating our systems. These are other important factors that have to be taken into consideration from when we talk about personality. When we look at Skinner, B.F. Skinner really only focused here the situation, and he talks about how the situation is what determines behavior and determines mental processes. But Bandura extends that further and says that yes, situational variables are important, no doubt, but also person variables. And these, of course, are shaped by our environment and shaped by a lot of things as well, genetics, environment, things like that. So Bandura really takes it one step further than B.F. Skinner, in my opinion. So if we want to predict people's behaviors, we really have to know a lot about how that person values the particular behavior, and what their sort of expectations are about the outcome. So for example, if somebody places a tremendous value in a particular task and they expect to succeed, we would expect their behavior to look very differently than somebody who doesn't place a lot of value in the task and maybe expects failure. We would predict a lot different effort in those, and maybe motivation in those situations. And Bandura, anytime we talk about Bandura, we have to talk about expectations in terms of like efficacy beliefs. These are the things that kind of influence those expectations that we have. When we feel efficacious, when we feel like we can do something, that tends to lead to much higher motivation and self-esteem on our part. We're more likely to feel like we can achieve. We're more likely to feel good about ourselves, versus when we have low self-efficacy, when we don't, feel like we can do something, then our value and expectations change dramatically, depending on the situation. And we talked about this a little bit in chapter 5, but we're kind of back to this idea of observational learning. And really, Bandura is trying to emphasize the point of a lot of our personality is shaped by a lot of different factors, including, other people. We observe and we watch other people. We are social animals, and we live in societies and amongst a lot of different people. So this is our chance to learn from others, and our personality and the way we think and the way we behave is shaped by simply watching other people. So again, we've evaluated all the different theories up to this point. If we look at learning perspective, again, it places a tremendous amount of emphasis on behavior. It does not put a lot of emphasis on cognition. And it kind of looks more at kind of what fosters learning and doesn't, again, not really explicitly taking into account personality. The learning perspective, social cognitive theory is kind of takes it one step further, but is still not exactly perfect either. Doesn't take into account things like self-awareness, and also really doesn't talk about anything in terms of about genetics. That's another important factor when we look at individual differences and how those shape personality. We were all born with a certain set of genetics, and other things influence our behaviors, but our genetics play a big part in how we think and behave. So, this theory is still, social cognitive theory definitely, has some room for improvement as well. So, another thing we're going to talk about as far as personality is concerned, when we talk about your environment, one of those things has to do with gender typing, how the genders, male and female. Now, of course, when we talk about gender right now, we're only looking at a pretty strict binary definition, but, gender is, from my understanding and how we think about gender now in 2019, is a much more nuanced understanding. It's not so much black and white, but for the sake of this argument, we're going to kind of think about it in terms of black and white, male or female, blue or pink, or however you want to think about it. But, we look at why are there differences in the way that males and females act? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, it might be, we could look at it from natural selection, that males and females differ in their behavior because that has allowed us to survive, sort of divvying up the tasks of male tasks and female tasks. It sort of allows us to thrive and survive as a species. You can dig a lot deeper into that if you want, but that's sort of just the evolutionary perspective. That's one way of thinking about it. A biological perspective talks about, the differences come from the different exposures to prenatal hormones during prenatal development. That we look at, okay, we're looking at a specific biological cause. Why do males and females act differently? Well, it has a lot to do with genetics as well. However, we have a few other perspectives to consider. Those previous were very much biological, sort of genetic-based perspectives. Social cognitive perspective it says, hey, we act differently, males and females, we act differently because of observational learning. Like when children, let's say, for example, a child who's growing up in their household and they see mom cooking and cleaning around the house, and they see dad going to work and coming home, at a certain time every day, they kind of develop these stereotypes of what genders do. Mom works at home and cleans the house. Dad goes off and, raises and earns money for the house. And conversely, if we see an opposite kind of household where you have a stay-at-home dad and a mom who goes and works, or if you have two breadwinners in the home, you can see how our thoughts about how genders are to behave changes differently depending on, kind of what you're exposed to, what you are raised around. And kind of adding to this is this idea of gender schema theory, and where children kind of learn a schema or an understanding of the world based upon their gender. They learn to see the world sort of through that lens. A schema is just a lens by which we see the world. So they're sort of arguing that, if we flip the gender, if things were flipped, we would see the world very differently. If you were a male and we could change the world and you were a female, you would see the world much differently. You would have a different sort of schema to operate from. And we think about, these ideas are sort of imprinted upon children at a very young age. Look at this picture just a few slides ago. We're determining characteristics of gender before the child is even born. We have the blue box versus the pink box, and mothers may speak to their child in utero differently when they're male versus female. When they know, we assign certain traits to males and females. Specifically like males, aggressive and assertive and rational and courageous are words that you might, commonly associate with being masculine, whereas with female, maybe it's emotional and sensitive and kind and gentle and things like that might be associated with females. We're starting to see that that's not quite the case, that, these traits are applicable to both genders, when we talk about male and female. But this is sort of, we see these stereotypical traits being developed very early on in terms of how children interact with their parents, how parents interact with their children, the types of toys they buy, all kinds of things sort of shape this idea of gender typing. Okay, we're now going to switch gears into another perspective, humanistic-existential, in terms of personality. And really, these two perspectives kind of go hand in hand with each other. The humanistic perspective says, hey, we are all capable of free will, free choice, and self-growth. We're all capable of becoming better versions of ourselves. And there's a huge emphasis on self-awareness. You can't get better, you can't improve if you don't become more self-aware. And kind of adding on to this is this existentialist idea that we are free and we are there to determine our own behavior, which is both very liberating and both very scary at the same time. It's like, hey, we all have this ability to grow, but it is entirely on us to make that happen. We can't wait around and expect others to grow for us. We have to do the hard work ourselves. So again, it's very exciting, but it's also scary if you're, someone who is maybe not accustomed to putting in that sort of hard work, so to speak. All right, and the people you should associate with this particular perspective are Maslow and Rogers. We've talked about Maslow before. According to Maslow, we talked about the hierarchy of needs and sort of this orientation towards self-actualization. That's kind of the way he's describing our personalities, that our personalities are geared towards growth, and we're all sort of striving after this idea of self-actualization, becoming the best version of ourselves. And then Rogers, we talked about Rogers, I think, in a previous chapter, but Rogers talks about personality is really interchangeable as use. We can think about personality as this idea of the self, as an individual, unique self, something and someone separate from other people and other beings. And when we think about the self, we think about personality and self. It's really our response to the questions such as, who am I? What am I good at? What do I like? Things like that. And that's those questions kind of reveal to us a lot about our personality, how we behave, how we think, and it also gives rise to this idea of an individual, unique self. And kind of attaching onto that, we have this idea of self-concept, how we sort of think and evaluate our own selves. We use ourself oftentimes as a point of reference when trying to think and understand the rest of the world. And again, this is what gives rise to this idea of a unique individual self, that I am in fact different from all other people. We might be similar in some ways, but I am a unique individual, and I see things from this particular perspective. I'm able to take others' perspectives, but I also have a unique way of kind of looking and seeing and thinking about the world. And my personality, in a sense, is unique as well. So how do we foster, according to Rogers, how do we foster some of this free will, some of this, growth? Well, we have to be in environments where people provide us unconditional positive regard. Basically, people will accept us even when we have flaws. That's a lot different than conditional positive regard, where we accept somebody only when they behave in a desired manner. Unconditional positive regard is kind of like the way we think our parents and our loved ones really care for us. Even when we make mistakes, they support us, they have our back, they love us even when we make mistakes. And this gives rise to this whole idea of client-centered therapy where, within this therapeutic setting, you have the therapist exhibiting positive regard and warm feelings and acceptance and basically teaching the client, the person, to do this towards themselves. And this is what gives rise to this ability for self-growth and self-actualization. Oftentimes people will go to therapy, when they kind of feel like, I'm feeling a little stagnant in life. I'm feeling like things are kind of in a rut. And this is a way to kind of get out of that rut, to really maximize your potential as a human being or to reach self-actualization. All right. So, anyways, this theory is another good one. However, because there's a big emphasis on free will and our personal and conscious experiences and how we can use those towards self-growth. However, a lot of this is when we talk about conscious and personal experiences, we're really talking about very private and subjective experiences that people have to share. And sometimes people aren't always good at, expressing, how those events took place and how they feel and et cetera, et cetera. And this theory really neglects different personality types and different traits. It kind of broadly speaks about personality geared towards self-actualization, but doesn't really talk about doesn't talk about what are the traits that kind of make somebody, what are the traits that make up self-actualization, or there are certain personality types that are geared towards self-actualization, for example. So still leaves some holes. All right, let's see. Quick comprehension check before we move on. A child who consistently strives for an A in math and science in order to secure the affection of her parents is trying to establish A, unconditional positive regard, B, conditions of worth, C, self-actualization, or D, empathy. Go ahead and pause the video and write your answer down and see what you think. Come back when you're done. All right. Welcome back. The correct answer is B, conditions of worth. The child is trying to, rather than unconditional positive regard, the child in this case may feel like they have conditional positive regard, like my parents will only show me affection if I do well in school, versus unconditional positive regard, where my parents always show me affection even when I'm not doing good in school or when I am doing good in school. Okay, one other perspective and personality we're going to look at is sociocultural perspective, and essentially this is saying that our personality is influenced by a lot of contextual factors, including our ethnicity, our gender, the culture we grew up in, our socioeconomic status. All of those things influence personality, behavior, and mental processes. So you're going to see different personalities from people who come from different cultural perspectives or sociocultural perspectives. And we can divide this up sort of broadly speaking. We have individualistic versus collectivist sociocultural perspectives. We have individualist is much more typical of like the United States and Europe and more developed nations, but we see a much bigger emphasis on the self rather than the group identity. There's a much more emphasis on personal goals rather than group goals. And this is compared to a more collectivist understanding of culture, where there's a greater emphasis on group dynamics and establishing group goals. And you see this type of cultural context more so in developing nations, especially like in Asian and South American and African, those continents. You're more likely to see some of this collectivist mentality there, more so than you would maybe in the United States. And this graph just really depicts kind of what's going on. What is the importance? In picture A, we're looking at more of an individualistic perspective versus the collectivist perspective here in part B. And there's much more interdependence versus independence if this helps to make, to understand the difference between the two. All right, let's see. We talked about self-esteem earlier. When we talk about acculturation, self-esteem is self-esteem and acculturation go hand in hand as people move into new cultures, whether we're talking about immigrants coming to a new nation or we're talking about, kids moving to a new school. We know that, self-esteem is very important for kind of transitioning to a new culture. And there's a lot of research that shows that self-esteem tends to be highest for those people who do not surrender their original culture, that they in fact adopt sort of biculturalism, that they keep some of the things that work from their old culture and adopt some of the new things that work, from their new culture that work. That tends to be, where the research shows that self-esteem is highest. When people completely throw away their old culture or refuse to adopt the newest culture, this is where self-esteem and kind of navigating in this new world, this new culture becomes pretty difficult. But those who kind of embrace the best of both worlds tend to be the ones who have the highest self-esteem as far as acculturation goes. All right, so some things about sociocultural perspective. This theory is really important because it brings a lot of factors into consideration for personality formation. We're talking about gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, culture. All these things shape our personality, and it allows us to kind of see personality as a much more nuanced phenomenon, and allows us to really see that the diversity, there's so much diversity in terms of the way we think and the way we behave, and it is influenced by the vast amount of diversity that surrounds us, culturally speaking. Okay, truth or fiction, the most well-adjusted immigrants are those who abandon the language and customs of their country of origin and become like members of the dominant culture in their new host country. What do you think? Pause the video, come back when you have the answer. That is in fact fiction, not true. The most well-adjusted immigrants are those who adopt who maintain their language and customs and also adopt some new customs and new language, from their new host country. They kind of blend the best of both worlds, find what fits from both cultures and mesh it together, to work for you. All right, so last thing we're going to talk about are personality tests. And when we talk about personality tests, or really any kind of measurement in psychology, they're sort of characterized by a few different classifications. You have validity, which means, hey, are we measuring what we mean to measure? So when we measure personality, are we actually measuring personality, or are we measuring something else? Reliability, so how consistent do we expect our results? How stable are the results going to be from one testing to another? And then the process being standardized, meaning everybody goes through the same procedure when they take this test. The processes, the administration, the way it's scored, the way it's graded, all those things are standardized, meaning everybody gets the same experience. So, there are different types of personality tests. You can look at, some are behavioral rating scales where, for example, you might be shown like a list of several, a list of a bunch of behaviors and kind of mark, hey, I like doing this, or I don't like doing this. It could be used to assess different behaviors in a wide variety of settings, including classrooms, mental health facilities, or another place where you kind of see these. These might be rated by the individual themselves or scored by somebody watching the behavior. There also might be aptitude and interest tests that are used as well to kind of get an insight to what you might, what kind of job you might like in the future. These are kind of using personality theory to look at, hey, how could your personality fit into certain jobs? What jobs are the best fit for your personality and your interests, for example. So there are a couple of different types of personality tests. There are objective tests, which means the way you answer the items is very limited, meaning it's like multiple choice, like there are only 4 or 5 answers, for example. It's a forced choice format. It's not an open-ended essay type question where you can respond openly. It's very much like you only have a few choices. And an example of this would be the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is a really popular personality test that's used for diagnosing psychological disorders. And it has these different scales that have been tested and retested over and over again. That's what we mean by empirically constructed. Another quick truth or fiction question. Psychologists can determine whether a person has told the truth on a personality test. What do you think? Truth or false? Pause the video. The answer is actually fiction. That's one of the problems with using self-report measures, is that sometimes we don't know when people are lying or not. There are subtle ways that you can kind of determine if they are. Like you can ask a question or you can make a statement and then ask the opposite question or make the opposite statement later on in the test. And if you see inconsistencies in the way somebody responds, maybe it could mean that they're not telling the truth, but we don't really know. It's just it's a way to sort of catch inaccuracies in the way they respond, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're lying or not telling the truth. Maybe they just weren't paying attention, for example. Projective tests. These are tests where there is no particular correct response. There's no correct answer. There's maybe not even a limitation in the way you answer. You project your personality onto the particular response. And there are a couple of tests you've probably heard of before. The first is a Rorschach Inkblot test, very common in pop culture. You've probably heard of Rorschach test before. The other is a Thematic Apperception test, which I'll show you an example in a moment. So last true-false question, I think, for this chapter. There is a psychological test made up of ink blots, and test takers are asked to say what the blots look like to them. We already kind of know the answer, but go ahead and write your answer down if you think you know it. Come back when you do. The answer is true. It's the Rorschach test. We haven't looked at one of those yet, but here's an example. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but this is a Rorschach test. It's this ink blot. We got mirror images on both sides. You're asked to look at an ink blot and basically say, hey, what does it look like? Tell me what you see here. And depending on how you respond, this is supposed to be sort of a window into your mind and sort of, reveals things about your personality, depending on how you respond. However, again, I'm just going to preface it now, they're not very reliable. I mean, there's sort of code books for trying to understand how people interpret these, but, they're so widely open for interpretation. Reliability and validity for both of these, for this type of item is not very high. So they're really interesting, but probably not the best test for measuring personality. Another example, a similar example, is the TAT, the Thematic Apperception test. This is a test where you're shown a picture. Rather than an Inkblot picture, it's usually just like a scene. Maybe it's a woman sitting in a chair reading a book, for example, and you have to basically come up with a story about kind of what's going on in the drawing. And the idea behind this is it's supposed to give us a window into maybe some of your motivations, your attitudes, your personality, all kinds of things. As if you just come up with a story, maybe in the words you choose or the scenario you create, you're going to reveal a little bit about yourself, maybe than just simply talking about yourself that you would otherwise. This is kind of getting back into a very Freudian idea that we can get into the unconscious mind, by just letting things kind of flow forth, just speaking openly and freely. Maybe something will kind of flow forth from the unconscious mind to reveal a little something about our personality. So that is it for chapter number 10. We are finished. We're done with chapter 10, and we're going to move on to bigger and better things. I think we'll move on to chapter 11 next, which will be stress. So tune back in soon for that one, and I'll see you all next time. All right, take care.